everyone and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. This is my April reading wrap up. So in April I read 12 books, which is quite a lot. They were very heavily weighted towards the second half of the month as I was awful busy the first half. A lot of kind of comfort reads, I think 3 rereads, shorter books. So yeah, it was an interesting reading month and good overall, I think. So I've been thinking about wrap ups again, and because I read so much historical fiction, I've been thinking about doing them kind of in the order that the book is set in or was written in the case of classics, or like in the case of history that it was about. It's how I've always kind of fantasized about organising my bookshelves, so yeah, we'll see. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Restoration by Rose Tremain. I'm delighted to have finally gotten to this book. So I read the second Merivel book, which is the sequel to this one, A Man of His Time, a few years ago and loved it, but never got around to reading the first one. So Merivel is a physician who becomes involved with the court of Charles II during the Restoration, as the title would imply. Merivel is such an interesting character. He's very kind of reluctant physician, I suppose. He's very much interested in clothes and colour, and he really stumbles through life. I don't think he's as likeable as the second book, probably because he's, you know, a bit younger here, and some of the things you don't really respect him much for them, but it does add to how interesting he is as a character. Really enjoyed Merivel. So coincidentally, I suppose, that book was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and this next book was also shortlisted, which is Parrot and Olivier in America by Peter Carey. It was really hard to know what to make of this book. It wasn't really what I expected. I was expecting it to be a lot more comedic, and there are some comical elements, but it's really more a book that make you smile rather than like laugh out loud. So Olivier is this French nobleman who flees France during the French Revolution, and Parrot is his reluctant English servant. The relationship between them is really fascinating, but a lot of attention is given to like their backstory, and like it's kind of alternating perspectives between the two of them. So it's not really a traditional master-servant relationship. Parrot has always dreamed of being an artist, but he does end up being a servant to Olivier instead, and eventually they do end up in America, as the title would suggest. One of the best parts about it was kind of the comparison between France and America in those times. The butt of a bit of humour, but also some interesting perspectives. I wouldn't say I loved this book, but I think it would benefit from a reread. It is quite like a heavy book. It's not really a light read, but I do love this cover. It's the cover that made me pick it up in the first place. If I do see more Peter Carey, I would definitely pick it up. So the next book is my second Georgette Hare that I've ever read, and that's Friday's Child. I would say I enjoyed this about as much as the other Georgette Hare I read, which was The Quiet Gentleman. I read it I think the year before last. I really want to like Georgette Hare, but I can't love her really. I think it's probably just a little bit too close to like pure romance than I'd be used to reading. Georgette Hare's books kind of focus a lot more on the aristocracy, whereas Jane Austen's books maybe are slightly below that in the social order. One thing that always kind of bothers me about Georgette Hare is like the characters' names. Like, a hero is the female lead and then the male lead is called Lord Sherry. It makes it difficult to take the story seriously for me. Hero is very young when she's married, like 17, and it actually made me like kind of sad how impressionable she was going into that marriage. And you know, so many girls back then were married so young. Yeah, I found that really food for thought, how kind of willing to please her husband she was. And yeah, I don't think I'll be seeking out any more Georgette Hare like new, but if I see one cheap second hand or something, I might pick it up again. So yeah, sorry about that lighting change, the sun has just come around. So the next book I'm going to talk about is the first reread I'm going to discuss, and that's Sharpe's Gold by Bernard Cornwell. I'm going to like reread these books really slowly. This is the second book in order of publication order, and Sharpe is kind of sent to retrieve some gold. So it's a really unusual kind of book, but funny, and this very memorable scene in the graveyard, which I really enjoyed reading. Also, it's the first appearance of Teresa. So I suppose more into the Victorian era, collection of short stories, the haunting season. I really did enjoy this. It was great to read one while I was on my lunch break. I know I kind of missed the ideal time of the year to read this book, but I was looking forward to it and I heard loads of people talking about it, so I said I'd just read it anyways and not leave it sitting on my shelf. The only authors that I've actually read from this collection before were Bridget Collins and Natasha Pulley, both of whose books I really enjoy. So I did enjoy their two stories as well, and my favourite probably was Natasha Pulley's story, which has characters from the watchmaker of Filigree Street, so it's nice to kind of get another glimpse into their life. I also really like this book called The Chillingham Chair by Laura Purcell, and I would say that like Thwaites Tennant, that was definitely the most disturbing story. So yeah, it was great to get like a glimpse of these really popular authors that I just haven't got the chance to read yet, and yeah, it's made me excited to pick up more of their work. And this is a great collection. I haven't read that many short stories, but I love that these were collected around a theme rather than an author, and that's definitely something I'd be interested in reading more of. So the next is a bit different, I suppose. It's a Victorian classic, another reread, and that's Villette by Charlotte Bronte. So I actually haven't read a Victorian classic yet this year, which is quite unusual for me, and I kind of forgot how much I enjoyed them, so I'd expect to see more Victorian classics on this channel for the rest of the year, and I've been thinking about a video about that maybe that'll be coming up soon. I loved this reread of Villette. I read it for the first time about 3 or 4 years ago when I wasn't as experienced at reading classics, and I would say I got a lot more out of it this time. I'd actually forgotten a lot of the plot, which always helps. The narrator, Lucy Snow, was really interesting. I love the way that she kind of held stuff back, even though it was like frustrating at times. It was just a really interesting technique for storytelling. I absolutely love the relationship that develops at the second half of this book, and like the surprise at the end. It's just, yeah, it was absolutely great, and the other person in it is such an interesting character. I just loved trying to work them out, and yeah, it just is so many twists and turns. I did remember what had happened at the ending, and yeah, it's always kind of a bit of a conflicted one, and I remember my mom isn't a reader, so I told her what happened at the end without being worried about spoiling her, and she was like, what? And I'm like, yeah, I know, what an odd ending, but yeah, that's just the way it is, I suppose. For anybody unfamiliar with Villette, it's about this girl called Lucy Snow, who through various circumstances has to go and teach in a school in Belgium, in what is like purportedly Brussels town called Villette, and it's kind of about her interactions with the students, with the other teachers, with like the doctor that comes to look after the students, and just how she integrates into Belgian society as an Englishwoman. Belgium is obviously a Catholic country, so there's a lot of reflections on the differences between Catholics and Protestants, which I found interesting. Charlotte Bronte will always rub me up the wrong way, because all of the Irish characters I've encountered in her books so far are always drunkards, and that kind of makes me a bit annoyed, so I'll never like her as much as I like Jane Austen, but undoubtedly this was a great book. I know people compare this to Jane Eyre a lot, and I haven't read Jane Eyre for about the same period, 3 or 4 years, so I'd say that'll be definitely one I'll be looking to reread this year, and to see whether I prefer it to Villette. At the moment I would say I prefer Villette, but I think that's just because I like the second half of the book so much. I'm not sure if I liked Jane Eyre as much, but maybe it was better overall, so yeah, I'll be curious to reread it and see what I think. So the next book I'm going to talk about then is A Single Thread by Tracey Chevalier, and I picked this up on the very strong recommendation of Read a Book Gem, who always makes Tracey Chevalier sound absolutely fascinating. I read this on audiobook and I absolutely loved it. It's set after the First World War, and it follows this woman called Violet, who's kind of one of the spare women who's unexpectedly single, given that so many men have been killed in the war. At the start of the book she's looking after her very disagreeable mother, kind of trapped in a way, and this is the story of how she comes to carve out a life for herself that's independent, which isn't very easy to do for women back in that time. I loved that this book was so much a book about women. There was so many interesting parts in it, like do you know how harsh women can be with criticising each other, or like the difficulties of women walking alone. Singledom is obviously a lot easier in the 21st century, but still some of the things that were pointed out in this book still ring maybe painfully true. Personally I didn't really like the ending, but that was just me. I did love all the bits about embroidery. I used to sew a bit more, and it's something I would be interested in taking up again, so I loved that. And there's a lot about bell ringing as well, which was potentially slightly less interesting, but a lot of the book is set in Winchester, and I did visit Winchester Cathedral once and it was absolutely beautiful. But this book definitely made me want to go back for all the details that were pointed out in the book, and especially like the embroidered cushions and kneelers and that. So yeah, I'd highly recommend this book, A Single Thread. It was great. So the next book is another reread, and this is The Betrayals by Bridget Collins. My reread of this was really spurred by my going to see the new Fantastic Beasts film. I suppose I was looking for a similar kind of relationship that was depicted in that film, and I remembered that it was in this book, in the kind of academic like competitiveness between Carfax and Leo. So this book is about those two friends in this school where they kind of study this mysterious game called the Grand Jeu. It's not really clear what it is. It's like a mixture of like art and maths and music and loads of different things. Yeah, it's not very easy to describe, but it's the characters really that make this book. There's a timeline that's set when Leo was in school, and then in his adult life he comes back to the school for various political reasons. It's kind of the politics of this book are interesting as well, even if they're not really clearly explained. It's just kind of the backdrop against what the book takes place. Yeah, I was interested to see what I would think of this book again on a reread, because I really did love it last time, but the ending was a bit controversial for me, and to be honest it still is controversial. I can see that it works, but it was the right ending. I just didn't absolutely love the ending, but yeah, no, I love Bridget Collins, and I would really actually love to reread the Binding as well, her other book. So more into the modern day, I suppose. The next book I'm going to talk about is Maid by Nita Prose, which is a new release. It follows this maid called Molly. It's heavily implied that she's somewhere on the autistic spectrum, though it's never gone into in detail, and we see her life and her work as a maid through her eyes, specifically when one day she finds one of the guests dead in a bedroom when she's cleaning it. So it's kind of a very unusual murder mystery, and I just loved looking at life through Molly's eyes. And the interactions she had with other characters. There's a lot of discussion on the relationship she had with her grandmother. Sometimes Molly is frustrating when you can very clearly see that she's being manipulated by other characters, even though she can't see it herself. But yeah, I'd really recommend this book for a really unusual murder mystery with a nice ending. So the next book was another reread, the last one I'm going to talk about, and that was Normal People by Sally Rooney. I read this on ebook, so I don't have a physical copy. Again, I absolutely loved this book. On my first read, I was blown away by it. It tells the story of Marianne and Connell. It starts off when they're in school, and Connell is kind of the popular guy in school. He plays sport, he has loads of friends, and Marianne is from a higher social class, as is wealthier, but she doesn't have the same circle that Connell has, and she's very isolated, and they form this incredibly complicated relationship. On my first read, I suspected maybe I just liked it because it starts off in like a rural town in the west of Ireland in Sligo. I'm from Galway, but Sligo would be close enough, and then they go to Trinity for college, which is where I went to college, and there's so many things about the second half, they're just like so Trinity. So I thought it might be my personal connection, but on a reread I can see it's the personal connection, but also it's just a really fabulous book. So anybody that hasn't read Normal People yet, it's not overrated. It is a truly excellent book and a great character study. I still haven't read any of Sally Rooney's other books, which I must get to at some stage and stop all this rereading. So the next book I'm going to talk about is another Irish book, and that is Here Comes the Beehive by Sarah Crossan. The most unusual thing about this book, I suppose, it's told in verse, which I always found kind of not off-putting, but like a bit intimidating. But I saw this copy in Dublin for €5 when I was up to see Ed Sheeran. I picked it up and I read it the next day, and it was absolutely fantastic. So it's not an intimidating kind of verse at all. It makes it a really kind of fast read. The premise of this book, I suppose, is at the start, this character called Connor passes away, and Anna, his solicitor, who's been having an affair with for 3 years. Being his solicitor, she has to deal with his wife and how that turns out, and just things that are revealed throughout the book are just so unexpected, and it was such a great story. The last book I'm going to talk about is another Irish author, 3 in a row, and that was Geometry Lobochevsky. So this is a book I just saw in Dublin again when I was up there. I was just intrigued by the premise. It's basically about this mathematician who comes to help Board Namona, which is kind of the state body for looking after peat or turf in Ireland, to help these Irish surveyors survey a bog in the 1950s. So I suppose regrettably our house is still heated by turf, and I was just intrigued to see what somebody could write about a bog. So yeah, this was of course about so many other things. It's one of those books that is very hard to say in a short sentence what it's about, but the one thing I would say is like I was a bit confused over the ending. The like prologue and the end seem to kind of contradict each other a bit, but maybe I just didn't follow it completely. I loved the perspective that this Russian from the Soviet Union had on Ireland in the 1950s, how he kind of saw Irish mannerisms. I suppose one really fun thing is the names. When he first meets characters, the names are like spelled phonetically the way a Russian would spell them. So like Colum, which we would spell Colm, is spelled Kolim. I liked the more mathematical aspects, even if I didn't follow them all completely. It was just an unusual perspective, I suppose. It was just such a thoughtful and like well written book about an unusual subject. So that's it. That's my April reading wrap up. I'm sorry if it was a bit fast. I have to leave in a few minutes, but yeah, it was a good reading month, and I can't wait for May. I'm going to take part in the historical fiction read along. Of course, I mostly read historical fiction anyways, but I'm excited for that. And yeah, let me know down below what you read for April and your highlights, and what you're going to read for May. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for another video.